September 13th, 2024. Just 2 days earlier, her divorce had been finalized and a permanent protective order was granted. That should have been the moment she could finally breathe, finally feel safe. Instead, it became the day her worst fears came true. Outside the Spalding County Courthouse in Griffin, Georgia, broad daylight turned into horror when gunfire erupted. A 44-year-old mother who had spent years leaving warnings collapsed beside her car. She had told everyone what was coming, and no one stopped it. What makes this case especially haunting is that Crystal Evans didn't just hope the system would protect her. She begged for it. In that courtroom, she pleaded with the judge to arrest her ex-husband immediately, telling the court her life was in danger. The request was denied. He was allowed to surrender on his own time. Minutes after that final hearing ended, her friend reportedly asked for a deputy to walk her to her car. That escort never came. She waited, trying to buy herself time, then walked alone across the street. Just yards away, the man she had feared for years was waiting with a gun. She had done everything we tell survivors to do. She filed for orders of protection, she showed up in court, she documented threats, she left behind a trail of evidence. And still, the system left her exposed. Before we uncover what led to this tragic ending, I need to ask you, how does a woman plead with the court for her safety, leave behind years of proof, and still die steps away from the very building where she asked for help? Share your thoughts in the comments, because what happened to Crystal Evans is not just a personal tragedy. It is a failure so complete that an entire community is still demanding answers. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story and tell us where you're watching from. Every click, every share, helps keep Crystal's warning alive and makes it harder for the system to ignore women like her. Marjorie Crystal Evans, known by almost everyone as simply Crystal, was 44 years old. She wasn't just a name in a headline or a woman in a tragic story. She was a woman who worked hard to build a life for herself and her family. Friends describe her as someone who could walk into a room and instantly fill it with warmth. She had that presence, the kind that makes you feel like you've known her forever, even if you'd only just met. Her laughter, her hospitality, her generosity, those things made her unforgettable. Crystal was also a mother. Her daughter, Precious, was at the center of her world. She wasn't just a parent who checked boxes. She was deeply involved, from everyday dinners at the kitchen table to celebrations that felt like events. Birthdays were decorated with the kind of detail that showed just how much effort she put into making her child's life feel full and cherished. She wanted her daughter to grow up with stability, joy, and the sense of being loved beyond measure. But Crystal's life wasn't only about family. She was also an entrepreneur and a builder, literally. Alongside her then-husband, Tom Mallory, she co-ran TMK Contracting, a construction business that started small and grew into something substantial. On paper, Tom's name was tied to the company, but in reality it was Crystal who kept it moving. She handled operations, logistics, and finances. She was organized yet creative, tough when she had to be, but graceful in how she carried herself. Colleagues and friends remember her as the one who could negotiate a contract in the morning and still host a family dinner at night. That balance of strength and care defined her life. Crystal Evans was a fighter and a woman determined to leave behind more than memories. She left a record that proved she was aware of the danger she lived under, and a record that now stands as a haunting reminder of how a system can fail even the most vocal, determined victims. She was building a future for herself and her daughter, but in the background, she also knew she had to prepare for the possibility that her warnings might one day become evidence. Her life was not just defined by tragedy, it was defined by resilience, love, and an unwavering will to protect her child. And yet, even with all that she built and all that she gave, Crystal's story ended in violence she herself had predicted. The question that hangs heavy is simple. How does a woman who did everything right, who raised her voice, who left behind undeniable evidence, still end up silenced? In 2010, Crystal married Tom Mallory, a man she had known for most of her life. They both grew up in Griffin, Georgia, went to the same schools, and lived in the same community. It was the kind of history that made it easy to trust someone, the kind of familiarity that can make you believe you truly know who you're building a future with. To many people on the outside, it looked like the perfect match. Childhood ties blossoming into a family of their own. But like so many stories that begin with hope, cracks began to show. The marriage, which started with promise, gradually revealed signs of betrayal and disrespect. Crystal began to notice changes, distance, neglect, and behavior that no longer aligned with the man she thought she had married. In those early stages, the problems weren't shouted from rooftops. Instead, they appeared quietly, sometimes in the form of late nights, unexplained absences, or words that cut deeper than they seemed. Crystal turned to the place so many people do when they feel alone: social media. Her Facebook posts from those years didn't always spell everything out, but the hints were there. Posts that spoke of neglect, of being overlooked, of the pain that comes when the person you love most no longer treats you with the care you deserve. These weren't dramatic outbursts. They were quiet signals, subtle reminders that something inside her marriage was breaking. Then came 2020. On her Facebook page, Crystal shared a post that seemed full of optimism. She wrote about reconciliation, about how faith had helped restore their marriage, and how she believed they had found their way back to each other. To her friends and followers, it may have looked like a happy ending to a rough patch, a couple that had struggled but managed to come out stronger, leaning on God to mend what was broken. But beneath that picture of restoration was a reality many survivors of abuse know too well. The cycle of hope and disappointment, the desire to hold a family together even when the foundation is shaking. Survivors often minimize what they've endured, not because it wasn't real, but because admitting the full weight of it feels impossible when children, businesses, and years of shared history are at stake. Crystal's willingness to try again, to post about love being restored, reflected the hope she still carried for her marriage, but it also revealed just how much she was willing to sacrifice to protect the life she had worked so hard to build. Her posts showed the world a woman who was strong in faith, determined to keep her family together, and willing to believe in change. But as the years would reveal, what looked like reconciliation was only temporary. The cracks never really closed. They only deepened. By the time the marriage reached its breaking point, Crystal discovered something that shook her to the core. Through her own words, her posts, and her recordings, she revealed that Tom was living a double life. On Facebook, she began sharing what she said were receipts, evidence that her husband was not only unfaithful, but that his affairs were with men. In one post, she wrote openly about how she had been on the wrong team all along, laying bare her feelings of betrayal. But she made something very clear. This was not about who he chose to be with. It was about the lies, the secrecy, and what she described as the misuse of their family's finances to support those relationships. According to Crystal, the money she worked hard to manage for their business and their household was being spent on vacations, cars, and gifts for other men, while she was left holding the responsibilities at home. Crystal wasn't quiet about it. She didn't try to keep the shame inside or hide the truth from her community. Instead, she used her Facebook page as a platform. She exposed the details publicly, naming the betrayal for what it was, and posting recordings of arguments that made it impossible to deny what was happening. In one of those recordings, Tom can be heard in a heated exchange with another man, a moment Crystal shared online to show the world the reality she was living. For a woman in a small town, this choice carried enormous weight. Griffin, Georgia is not a city where secrets stay hidden for long, and Crystal's decision to go public turned private pain into a community conversation. The betrayal wasn't only about infidelity, it was about humiliation. To endure years of work, to raise a daughter, to help build a business, and then to watch it unravel in front of friends, neighbors, and family members was devastating. The emotional toll of that betrayal is hard to measure. It wasn't just that Tom was unfaithful. It was that Crystal had invested her life into someone who, according to her own accounts, not only deceived her, but used the resources they had built together to fund his other life. In her posts, the anger, the disbelief, and the exhaustion were all there. She wasn't just telling her story to vent, she was leaving a record that showed the world what she had endured, and one that made it impossible for anyone to later say they didn't know. In those moments, Crystal's strength was clear. She chose truth over silence, exposure over secrecy. But that decision also meant she had stripped away Tom's ability to control the narrative. And when someone has spent years hiding a double life, having it uncovered so publicly in a small community can change everything. As the marriage unraveled, the tension between Crystal and Tom escalated into something far more dangerous. By 2024, her Facebook page read like a survival log, filled with warnings that painted a chilling picture of the life she was living. On August 3, 2024, just weeks before her death, she wrote openly that Tom had threatened to kill her. She added that she was leaving a paper trail, a phrase that now stands as one of the most haunting pieces of evidence she ever left behind. It was not a vague fear. It was specific, written in her own words, and visible for anyone who cared to read it. Law enforcement knew their names well. Sheriff Daryl Dix would later acknowledge that deputies had been called out on multiple occasions to respond to domestic disputes involving the couple. But in his words, those situations often ended without arrest because deputies could not identify a primary aggressor under Georgia law. There was at least one arrest in the past, but Tom was quickly released on bond. Each time, the cycle seemed to restart, with Crystal posting another warning, and Tom continuing to appear in her life in ways that made her feel constantly unsafe. In her posts and in accounts shared with those around her, Crystal described a pattern of relentless harassment. She said he stalked her, following her, showing up in places he knew she would be. One of the allegations she shared was that he stole her car, forcing her to make it her own again by repainting it once she got it back, as if to wash away the violation. Other allegations went even further. According to Crystal, in 2019, Tom fired a gun outside her home and later tried to deflect suspicion by filing a false active shooter report. She also alleged that he had gone after her property on paper, forging a deed to her home and using a notary stamp to make it appear legitimate. At one point, she said he barricaded her inside her own house, refusing to let her leave. She described him cutting off her utilities, her water, her power, her internet, leaving her in the dark, both literally and figuratively. And perhaps most disturbing of all, she alleged that he crawled underneath her house to listen in on her private conversations, later repeating things she had said as a way of proving that he was always watching, always close, always in control. Each of these allegations added to the portrait Crystal was building, a portrait of fear, intimidation, and control. What is striking is how consistent she was in documenting it all. Every post, every affidavit, every message was part of the paper trail she said she was leaving, evidence for the world to see. To her, the system might fail, but at least her words would remain, undeniable and in plain sight. By the time summer turned to fall in 2024, the warnings were no longer whispers. They were alarm bells. Crystal's social media painted the image of a woman who knew exactly what was coming, and a man who, in her view, had made his intentions clear. And yet, with all of this out in the open, nothing had stopped the escalation. Nothing had broken the pattern. By early 2023, Crystal was doing everything she could to get protection through the legal system. She filed for protective orders more than once, laying out in writing the threats, the stalking, and the danger she said she was living under. But those early attempts fell short. One petition was dismissed after she withdrew it, and another was tossed when both she and Tom failed to appear in court. Even then, the danger didn't go away. If anything, the pressure mounted and the sense of urgency only grew stronger. Fast forward to September 11, 2024. After years of turmoil, Crystal's divorce was finalized. On that day, the court also issued a permanent protective order against Tom Mallory. For many people, that kind of order represents safety. It's supposed to be the line in the sand that makes it illegal for an abuser to come near. But Crystal herself seemed to know that paper alone wouldn't stop him. According to reports, she pleaded with the judge to arrest Tom immediately, telling the court in plain terms that her life was in danger. She wanted him taken into custody, right then and there. The judge made a different decision. Instead of an arrest on the spot, Tom was allowed to voluntarily surrender at a later time. To the justice system, this was a routine step. To Crystal, it was a devastating blow. She left court that day still unprotected, knowing that the man she feared most was free, knowing that the threats he had made were still hanging over her head. Protective orders are designed to shield victims, but in reality, they often leave survivors in a vulnerable gap. The gap between paperwork and enforcement. The gap between a court ruling and an actual arrest. In Crystal's case, that gap was just 48 hours. Within that time, she would go from a woman seeking protection inside a courthouse to a victim killed right outside of it. Her story underscores a painful truth. Protective orders only work when the system enforces them swiftly and decisively. Allowing someone who has been accused of repeated threats to turn themselves in when convenient is more than a procedural decision. It can be the difference between life and death. For Crystal, it was the final warning sign that no one in authority was truly going to stop him. Friday, September 13, 2024. It was just after noon in downtown Griffin, Georgia. The courthouse was busy, like it always is on a Friday, with people finishing up hearings before the weekend. That morning, Crystal had gone inside for a proceeding unrelated to her divorce. Part of the proceeding centered on accusations that her ex-husband had stolen $30,000 from her. Money that, according to Precious's own words later shared publicly, was never returned, accompanied by her daughter, Precious, and a close friend. To anyone watching, it looked like a routine day in court. For Crystal, it was another reminder that she was still tied to a man she no longer wanted in her life. A man she had warned about over and over again. As the hearing went on, Precious stepped out early, grabbing her things and leaving the building. She didn't know it would be the last time she saw her mother alive. Crystal stayed behind with her friend until the courtroom business ended. When it was time to go, that friend later said she asked for a deputy to walk Crystal to her car. According to the sheriff's office, no such request was ever received. That dispute remains at the heart of the questions raised after the shooting. Was the system asked to protect her in that critical moment? Or was the request lost in the shuffle of courthouse routine? What we do know is that surveillance cameras recorded Crystal as she lingered, giving time for Tom Mallory to leave the courthouse first. It was a calculated pause, the kind of decision you make when you're hyper-aware of danger. She wanted distance between herself and the man she feared. Eventually, she walked outside, said goodbye to her friend, and made her way toward her car alone. Across the street, Tom Mallory was waiting. He was seated in his own car, watching. As Crystal approached her vehicle, he allegedly opened fire. Multiple rounds were shot into her car in broad daylight, right outside the very courthouse where, just 2 days earlier, a permanent protective order had been issued against him. The same courthouse where she had begged for safety. The gunfire ended her life there at the scene. Witnesses nearby heard the shots echo through downtown Griffin. People scattered, some ducking for cover, others frozen in disbelief that something so violent could happen just steps away from judges, clerks, and deputies. The place where she had sought justice became the place where her life ended. Tom fled immediately, speeding away as law enforcement gave chase. With police closing in, he turned the gun on himself. He shot once, but he did not die that day. He was found alive, critically injured, and taken to a hospital under guard. For the community, the pursuit and his self-inflicted wound didn't change the reality. Crystal Evans was gone. Her death wasn't hidden. It wasn't in the shadows. It happened in the open, outside a courthouse in the middle of the day. It's surrounded by people who should have represented safety. And in that moment, every warning Crystal had written, every plea she had made, was proven true. In the days that followed, investigators with the Griffin Police Department and the Spalding County Sheriff's Office worked quickly. Even as he lay in a hospital bed, felony murder warrants were obtained, charging Tom Mallory with the killing of his ex-wife. Court documents showed that authorities were ready to hold him accountable the moment he was discharged and taken into custody. The arrest paperwork stood as an acknowledgement of what had happened just outside the courthouse, that the warnings Crystal had left behind had ended in exactly the kind of tragedy she had said was coming. But Tom Mallory never made it to trial. For 2 weeks, he remained hospitalized, his condition monitored, his future seemingly set to play out in court. Then on September 28, 2024, he died from the wound he had inflicted on himself during that pursuit. With his death, the criminal case against him ended. There would be no jury, no cross-examinations, no conviction handed down. The legal path to justice closed with his final breath, leaving behind only the facts of what he had done and the hole it left in his community. Crystal Evans was gone. The man she had feared, the man she had warned about for years, was gone too. But his death did not bring closure. It left unanswered questions about why the system could not protect her, why her paper trail had not been enough, and how a woman who did everything she was supposed to do still ended up unprotected in the most vulnerable moment of her life. In the days after the shooting, the heartbreak turned quickly into outrage. Crystal's daughter, Precious, spoke out with a grief that cut through the noise. She said plainly, "Had someone walked her out, she'd still be here." Those words captured what so many in the community felt, that Crystal's death was preventable, that one small step could have made the difference between life and death. Sheriff Darrell Dix addressed the public not long after, and his words sparked even more debate. He described the marriage between Crystal and Tom as toxic, framing it as a relationship filled with conflict on both sides. He said deputies had responded to many domestic calls, but under Georgia law, they often could not identify a primary aggressor, which limited what they could do. He insisted his deputies were bound by the law, that their hands were tied, and that the same officers who could not arrest Tom earlier were the ones who tried desperately to save Crystal's life in that courthouse parking lot. But to many, that explanation fell flat. The paper trail Crystal left behind was undeniable. Years of posts, affidavits, protective orders, and written pleas. And yet it had all been treated as just paperwork, stacked on desks, filed in courtrooms, and never fully enforced when it mattered most. The community pushed back hard, questioning why the system had not acted sooner, why a judge allowed Tom to walk out of court just 2 days before, and why deputies could not do more even with repeated calls for help. The debate reached beyond Griffin. Advocates pointed to the gaps in Georgia's family violence laws, where protective orders can feel more symbolic than protective, and where voluntary surrender policies give dangerous individuals freedom in moments when survivors are most at risk. Others asked about accountability. Was it the court's decision that failed Crystal, the sheriff's office, or the very laws meant to protect people in her situation? The truth, many argued, was that it was all of the above. Crystal's story forced people to face uncomfortable questions about how domestic violence is handled, how women, especially Black women, are listened to, and how often those warnings are dismissed until it is too late. The outrage was not just about her death, but about the reality that everything she did to protect herself was not enough, because the systems around her did not respond with the urgency her words demanded. When Tom Mallory died in the hospital on September 28, 2024, the possibility of a criminal trial ended with him. There would be no courtroom testimony, no chance for a jury to weigh the evidence, no official conviction. For Crystal's family, that meant there was no traditional path to justice, no opportunity to see him sentenced for what he had done. But their fight did not stop there. In early 2025, the city of Griffin's own agenda confirmed that a wrongful death claim had been filed by Crystal's surviving children, including her daughter, Precious. That claim represents more than paperwork. It is a statement that her life mattered, that accountability cannot simply vanish because the person accused of her killing is gone. Civil action is different from criminal justice. It cannot put someone behind bars, but it can force institutions to answer hard questions. What did law enforcement know and when? Were the warnings ignored? Did failures in courthouse security and procedure contribute to her being left unprotected on the very day she needed safety the most? A wrongful death claim doesn't just seek financial compensation. It demands acknowledgement that the system failed, that lives were forever altered, and that accountability must be placed somewhere. For Crystal's family, pursuing civil action is about more than legal strategy. It is about reclaiming her story from being just another case, just another headline, and making sure that her name is tied to change. It is about asking the courts to recognize the weight of her warnings and the cost of dismissing them. It is about shifting the fight from what the criminal process could no longer provide to what civil accountability can still deliver. And for Precious, that fight has also been profoundly personal. In February 2025, she confirmed in a Facebook post that she had officially begun the process of removing Mallory from her last name, stating she would once again go by Precious Evans. That act was more than a legal formality. It was a public statement of separation from a legacy of violence and betrayal, while at the same time embracing her mother's name, her mother's strength, and her mother's story. Even though Tom Mallory will never stand trial, the questions his actions left behind remain. And in filing a wrongful death claim, Crystal's children have ensured those questions will not disappear quietly. The pursuit of justice continues, even if the courtroom now looks different than the one Crystal walked into just 2 days before her life was taken. Crystal did everything we tell women to do. She filed for protection. She left behind warnings. She documented her fear in her own words for the world to see. And still the system failed her. Her life ended just steps away from the courthouse where she had pleaded for safety. Her story cannot be just another headline. It cannot be forgotten, and it cannot be ignored. On screen right now, you will see the number for the National Domestic Violence Hotline, along with resources dedicated to protecting and uplifting Black women who are too often left unheard. If this story moved you, share it. Comment where you're watching from. Subscribe so we can keep saying their names. Every time you hit share, you make it harder for the system to ignore stories like Crystal's. Together, we can push for protection that truly saves lives.